Hollywood has lied to us about how heists work. They show us sleek black suits, synchronized watches, lasers, and hackers tapping away on glowing laptops in a dark room. They make it look like a ballet. Reality is a lot heavier. And a lot sweatier. On the morning of October 6, 1997, the FBI found a Loomis Fargo and Company armored van abandoned near a quiet business park in Charlotte, North Carolina. Inside the back of that van, investigators found $3.3 million in small denomination bills. The thieves hadn't left it behind because they were startled by a siren. They hadn't left it behind to send a message to the banks. They left over $3 million sitting in the back of an unlocked truck for one simple, hilarious, and deeply human reason. They had miscalculated the physics of cash. They physically ran out of room in their getaway cars. The money they did manage to steal, a staggering $17.3 million, weighed roughly 2,800 pounds. You can't just put 1.5 tons of paper into the trunk of a Honda Civic and expect it to drive away. The suspension will literally shatter. This is not the story of a criminal mastermind. This is the story of an unhappily married Gulf War veteran making $8.15 an hour, a former FBI informant living in a trailer park, and a completely botched conspiracy that triggered one of the most absurd, sprawling, and expensive manhunts in American history. To understand how a regular guy decides to break the banking system, you have to understand the environment that breeds a thief. In 1997, Loomis Fargo and Company was a behemoth. They were a newly consolidated corporation managing the literal lifeblood of the American economy, physical currency. Every day, rivers of cash flowed from retail stores to central banks, and Loomis was the dam that controlled it all. At their regional vault in Charlotte, that cash was guarded by a 28-year-old vault supervisor named David Scott Gant. On paper, David was exactly the profile of the man you want guarding a mountain of money. He had served in the military. He had a clean record. He was quiet, reliable, and practically invisible to upper management. He was a guy who kept his head down, clocked in, and did the heavy lifting. But beneath that uniform, David was a pressure cooker of resentment. Every single night, David locked himself inside a freezing concrete vault surrounded by tens of millions of dollars in unmarked, untraceable currency. He was the supervisor. He knew the camera blind spots. He held the master keys. And for bearing this massive, crushing responsibility, Loomis Fargo paid him exactly $8.15 an hour. Let's do the math on that. Before taxes, David was making about $326 a week. He was working agonizing shifts, sometimes logging 70 to 80 hours just to keep his head above water. He had a wife at home, Tammy, but the marriage was fracturing. He was never home, and when he was completely drained. There is a very specific kind of psychological torture that occurs when you are simultaneously destitute and in physical contact with vast, unimaginable wealth. You are starving, but you are forced to prepare a feast for someone else every single day. David was hauling plastic bins of cash that weighed more than he did. He would touch more money in a single 15-minute span than his entire bloodline would earn in a century. He was going home to worry about whether his beat-up truck would start in the morning, leaving behind $20 million sitting quietly on a shelf. It infects you. It wears down your morality. David felt cornered by his life. And when a man feels cornered, the unthinkable starts to look like a logical exit strategy. But every heist requires a spark. The vault was the fuel, but the match was a coworker named Kelly Campbell. Kelly worked at Loomis alongside David. She was bright, she was charismatic, and she paid attention to him. In an environment where David felt entirely invisible, Kelly looked right at him. They were both married, but the two of them struck up a close, intense friendship on the clock. Whether it was a full-blown romance or just a desperate crush on David's end, one fact is undisputed in the federal records: David Gant was utterly captivated by her. He would have done just about anything to impress her. In the Loomis break room, they would vent. They complained about the punishing hours. They complained about the insulting paychecks. And eventually, they started joking about the vault. How easy would it be? They'd ask. What if someone just loaded up a truck, drove out the bay doors, and never came back? It was the kind of dark, harmless corporate fantasy that millions of underpaid workers indulge in every single day. It's a coping mechanism. But then, Kelly Campbell quit Loomis Fargo. Usually, that's where the fantasy dies. The coworker leaves, the jokes stop, and the remaining employee goes back to the daily grind, a little more depressed than before. But Kelly kept in touch. And in August of 1997, she called David with a very different tone of voice. The break room jokes were no longer jokes. Kelly had been talking to an old high school friend. His name was Stephen Eugene Chambers. If David Gant was a man who felt invisible, Steve Chambers was a man who demanded to be seen. Steve lived in a cramped mobile home in Gaston County, North Carolina, but in his own head, he was a kingpin waiting for his crown. He was a small-time crook, a fence for stolen goods, and, crucially, a one-time confidential informant for the FBI. Steve had actually fed the feds information about a different armored car robbery years earlier. Because he had rubbed shoulders with federal agents, Steve possessed a dangerously inflated sense of his own criminal genius. He thought he knew exactly how the FBI worked. He thought he knew how to beat them. During the summer of 1997, Steve told Kelly that he wanted to hit Loomis. Kelly knew the perfect inside man. Welcome to the Heist Vault. Behind every heist there is a story. Some end in prisons, some end in graves, and some simply disappear. She pitched the idea to David. She told him that Steve had a foolproof plan. Steve knew how to fence the money. Steve knew how to hide from the feds. If David could just use his supervisor keys to get the cash out of the building, Steve would handle all the logistics. The plan they developed over the next few weeks was breathtakingly simple. Which is usually another way of saying it was destined for disaster. Because David was the vault supervisor, he didn't need explosives. He didn't need to hold guards hostage at gunpoint. He just needed to be the last man in the building. The strategy was set for the evening of October 4th, 1997. David would stay late. He would send his trainee home early. He would disable the internal closed-circuit cameras. He would then manually load as much cash as he could into a Loomis Fargo company armored van. Once loaded, he would drive to a predetermined location, a printing business called Reynolds & Reynolds in Northwest Charlotte. There he would meet Kelly, Steve, and a few accomplices. They would transfer the cash from the armored van into private vehicles and disappear into the night. But what about the morning? What happens when the sun comes up and the vault is empty? This is where the plan revealed its absolute glaring fatal flaw. This is where you see the sheer imbalance of risk. David Gant was going to take the entire fall. Since he would be the only employee unaccounted for the next morning, the FBI would instantly know he was the thief. His face would be on every news channel in the country by noon. So, the plan required David to vanish completely. He would take exactly $50,000 in cash, which, at the time, was the absolute maximum amount you could easily smuggle across the Mexican border without triggering immediate federal alarms. And he would flee to Cozumel. The remaining $17 million? That would stay with Steve Chambers in North Carolina. Steve promised to hold the money, keep it safe, and slowly wire David small amounts of cash to live on while he hid out in the tropics. Eventually, when the heat died down and the FBI moved on to other cases, David would return, and they would split the fortune. It was an absolutely terrible deal. But David Gant agreed to it. He was willing to throw away his marriage, burn his entire life to the ground, and leave his freedom in the hands of a trailer park grifter he had barely met. All because the woman he was infatuated with asked him to be brave for one night. On the evening of Saturday, October 4th, the Charlotte air was thick and humid. David walked into the warehouse for his shift. His stomach was in knots. He went through the motions. He sent his trainee home, claiming he would finish locking up. The building went completely silent. David walked up to the security feeds. He reached up and disabled 2 of the main CCTV cameras in the loading area. But his hands were shaking. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He was so terrified, and so focused on the sheer terror of what he was about to do, that he missed the 3rd camera. And that single oversight was about to give the Federal Bureau of Investigation a front-row seat to the most grueling, pathetic, and exhausting physical labor of David Gant's entire life. There is a popular myth that stealing millions of dollars requires a delicate touch. You crack a safe, you slip the diamonds into a velvet pouch, and you disappear into the shadows. David Gant did not have a velvet pouch. He had a rolling plastic mail cart, and a lower back that was about to experience the worst night of its life. When David disabled the 2 cameras he actually remembered, he walked up to the towering racks of the Loomis Fargo vault. Before him sat pallets of cash. This wasn't neatly banded sequential $100 bills straight from the mint. This was street money. It was 10s, 20s, 50s. It was bulky, it was dirty, and it was heavy. For over an hour, The night supervisor, entirely alone in a dead silent warehouse, engaged in a grueling repetitive CrossFit workout with federal currency. He was sweating through his uniform. His hands were raw. His muscles were burning. If you watch the surviving surveillance tape from that missed third camera, it doesn't look like a heist. It looks like a tragic underpaid warehouse worker fulfilling an impossible late-night shipping quota. By the time David had moved over $17 million, he had manually lifted and transported nearly 2,800 pounds of paper. That is the equivalent of picking up a Honda Civic piece by piece and carrying it across a room. He was entirely physically spent. He leaned against the vault. He was panting, drenched in sweat and staring at the racks. There was still millions of dollars sitting right in front of him. But he looked at the armored van. The heavy-duty suspension of the truck was groaning. The tires were visibly bulging under the sheer, concentrated mass of the money. He realized he couldn't do it anymore. He was out of time, and he was completely out of energy. He had to leave over $3 million behind simply because he was too tired to pick it up. David climbed into the driver's seat of the armored van. He started the engine. He didn't bother locking the vault. He didn't even close the bay doors. He put the truck in gear and rolled out into the humid Charlotte night, leaving the fortress wide open behind him. A few miles away, at a dark printing business called Reynolds & Reynolds, the rest of the crew was waiting. Kelly Campbell was there. Steve Chambers was there. They had brought a few accomplices and 2 civilian vehicles, Steve's pickup truck and a passenger car. When David pulled the armored van into the lot, there was no time for a celebration. There was no champagne. There was only pure unadulterated panic. They opened the back of the van and stared at the mountain of cash. And immediately Steve Chambers realized they had made a colossal mathematical error. They started frantically transferring the plastic-wrapped bricks of money from the van to the pickup truck and the car. They were throwing it into the bed, stuffing it into the trunks, shoving it into the back seats. But as they loaded the vehicles, the cars started sinking. Civilian cars are not designed to carry 1.5 tons of dense, concentrated weight. The undercarriages of their vehicles sank until they were hovering mere inches above the asphalt. The tires looked like they were going to pop. The suspension was totally maxed out. And they still hadn't emptied the van. They had shoved every single bill they could fit into those cars, but there was still $3.3 million sitting in the back of the Loomis truck. Steve looked at David. They had to leave it. If they put 1 more pound into those cars, they wouldn't be able to drive over a speed bump without tearing the axles out. So they made the call. They abandoned the armored van right there in the parking lot with $3.3 million sitting in the back, totally unsecured. Steve turned to David. This was the moment of truth. This was the handoff. Steve reached into the pile and pulled out $50,000. He handed it to David. Here's your walking around money, Steve told him. Get to the airport. We'll handle everything here. We'll send the rest when it's safe. David looked at Kelly. The woman he was burning his life down for. He expected a grand romantic farewell. He expected her to tell him she would be right behind him. Instead, it was rushed. It was cold. There was no grand embrace. Kelly was nervous, staring at the sinking cars and the abandoned van. They had to get off the street. David Gant took his $50,000, turned his back on $17 million, and drove away. Within hours, David was boarding a flight out of the country. He was heading for Cozumel, Mexico. He had never been a world traveler. He didn't speak Spanish. He didn't have a solid plan. He just had a duffel bag of cash, a fake identity that felt like a Halloween costume, and a desperate hope that the people he left behind were actually his friends. While David was somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, the sun came up in Charlotte. It was Monday morning. The first Loomis Fargo employees arrived for the day's shift. They swiped their badges. They walked onto the warehouse floor. And they stopped dead in their tracks. The heavy steel doors to the vault were wide open. The floor was littered with empty plastic straps, loose $20 bills, and abandoned carts. It looked like a tornado had touched down inside a bank. The facility manager immediately dialed the FBI. Within the hour, federal agents swarmed the warehouse. In a heist of this magnitude, investigators usually expect to find cut wires, jammed signals, and erased hard drives. They expect to be hunting ghosts. The lead investigators walked into the security room to check the tapes. They braced themselves for static. Instead, they hit play on the VCR. And right there, in crystal clear black and white footage, was David Gant. unmasked, sweating, hauling bin after bin of cash directly past the third camera he had forgotten to turn off. It wasn't a mystery. It was a documentary. The FBI agents stood in the security room, practically speechless. They didn't need to dust for prints. They didn't need to interview 100 suspects. They just had to ask the manager, "Hey, who is the guy on the tape lifting the boxes?" "That's David," the manager replied. "He's the night supervisor." By lunchtime, the FBI knew exactly who robbed the vault. They knew his name, his address, and his social security number. What they didn't know, however, was how a guy who made $8 an hour had managed to disappear with a payload that required a commercial forklift. They assumed David was a mastermind who had carefully orchestrated a brilliant, untraceable escape. They had no idea that the masterminds were currently in Gaston County, trying to figure out how to hide enough cash to fill a swimming pool. Let's talk about the absolute hardest part of stealing $17 million in physical currency. It isn't getting it out of the vault. It's figuring out what on earth you are supposed to do with it once you have it. On the morning of October 6th, while the FBI was watching David Gant on a security monitor in Charlotte, Steve Chambers was sitting in a cramped mobile home in Gaston County, North Carolina, staring at a literal mountain of paper. He had nearly $17 million sitting in his living room, stuffed into trash bags, duffel bags, and the trunk of his car. There is a concept in criminal investigations known as radioactive money. When cash is stolen in this volume, you can't just walk into a Bank of America and deposit it. You can't put it in a mutual fund. If you try to spend large amounts of it, you trigger federal reporting requirements. If you try to launder it without a sophisticated network, you leave a paper trail a mile wide. Steve Chambers did not have a sophisticated network. He had a trailer park, a wife named Michelle, and a dangerously high opinion of his own intelligence. The first rule of getting away with a massive heist is the golden rule of survival. Do not change your life. You keep your head down. You keep your cheap car. You keep eating the same cereal. You do not spend a dime until the heat dies down. Steve and Michelle Chambers broke that rule in spectacular, almost unbelievable fashion. Within weeks of the heist, the Chambers family decided they were done with mobile home living. But they didn't just move to a slightly nicer neighborhood. They moved into Kramer Mountain. Kramer Mountain was the most exclusive gated luxury community in the county. It was a place for doctors, lawyers, and old money. And suddenly, here came Steve Chambers, a man with no clear employment history, dropping roughly $600,000 on a sprawling multi-level mansion. He told the real estate agents and his new deeply suspicious neighbors that he had come into an inheritance. He told others he was a high-level investor. And then he started decorating. If you give a person who has never seen wealth an unlimited supply of cash, they don't buy subtle luxury. They buy what they think rich people are supposed to own. Steve and Michelle didn't buy minimalist art. They bought a cigar store wooden Indian. They bought gold-plated fixtures. They bought a life-sized velvet painting of Elvis Presley. And they didn't stop at the house. They bought a BMW Z3. They bought a luxury minivan. They bought expensive heavy gold jewelry and Rolex watches. Perhaps the most infamous purchase in the history of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division came when Michelle Chambers decided she wanted cosmetic surgery. She went to a local clinic for a breast augmentation, and when it came time to settle the medical bill, she didn't write a check. She paid for the entire surgical procedure in crisp sequential $20 bills. While the Chambers family was treating Gaston County like their own personal shopping mall, the FBI was setting up a perimeter. Agent David Walden and his team didn't have to launch a massive countrywide manhunt. They just had to park down the street from Kramer Mountain and take notes. Every time Steve bought a new car, a federal agent wrote it down. Every time Michelle bought jewelry, a federal agent requested the receipt. The FBI quickly secured court orders for wiretaps. They tapped the phones in the Kramer Mountain mansion. They tapped Kelly Campbell's phones. They tapped the pagers of their accomplices. The agents sat in their command center, listening in real time as Steve Chambers bragged about his purchases, complained about his accomplices, and incriminated himself a dozen times a day. The feds could have arrested them right then and there. They had the evidence. But they held back. Because they were missing two very important pieces to the puzzle. They hadn't found the bulk of the $17 million yet, and they hadn't found David Gant. 2,000 miles away, the man who had broken his back lifting 1.5 tons of cash was finding out exactly what his sacrifice was worth. David Gant was in Cozumel, Mexico. On paper, Hiding out in a tropical paradise with a duffel bag full of cash sounds like the ultimate dream. The reality is a nightmare of isolation. David didn't speak Spanish. He didn't know the culture. He was entirely disconnected from everything familiar. And he was terrified. Every time a police car drove past his hotel, his heart hammered in his chest. Every time someone looked at him too long in a restaurant, he thought his cover was blown. He only had the $50,000 Steve had handed him in the parking lot. 50 grand sounds like a lot of money, but when you are an international fugitive paying premium prices in tourist traps, bribing people to look the other way, and staying in expensive hotels because the cheap ones feel unsafe, that money evaporates quickly. David spent his days pacing his hotel room and drinking on the beach, staring at the ocean, waiting for the phone to ring. He was waiting for Kelly Campbell. Kelly was his anchor. She was the reason he did all of this. He believed with total sincerity that as soon as the coast was clear, Kelly was going to board a plane, fly to Cozumel, and start a new life with him. He would call her from payphones, feeding coins into the slot, desperate just to hear her voice. "When are you coming?" he would ask. Soon, David, she would tell him. "We just have to be careful. The FBI is everywhere. We can't make a move yet." What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that Kelly wasn't packing her bags. She was back in North Carolina, hanging out with Steve and Michelle, watching them spend his hard-earned money while making zero preparations to join him. As the weeks dragged into months, the $50,000 started to run dry. David began calling Steve, asking for the promised wire transfers. He needed more of his cut just to survive. At first, Steve sent a little bit. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. But then, the tone of Steve's voice on the phone began to change. The friendly "we're in this together" bravado faded. Steve started telling David that it was too hot. He claimed the banks were being monitored. He told David that sending money was too much of a risk. David was sitting alone in a sweltering room in the Yucatan Peninsula, slowly realizing he was running out of cash. But Steve Chambers was realizing something far more dangerous. Sitting in his air-conditioned mansion, surrounded by velvet paintings and luxury cars, Steve was doing the math. He realized that as long as David Gant was alive in Mexico, Steve's entire empire was at risk. If David ran out of money, he might come back. If David got arrested by the Mexican police, he would definitely strike a deal with the FBI and tell them everything. David wasn't a partner anymore. David was a loose end. And sitting on the wiretaps, the FBI agents heard the tone of the investigation change in a single afternoon. They heard Steve Chambers stop talking about wiring money and start talking about a permanent solution. The heist was over. The spending spree was ongoing. Now, they were planning a murder. When you steal $17 million, you have the capital to hire a professional. You can afford a shadow. You can afford a ghost, someone who flies in, leaves no trace, and vanishes before the sun comes up. Steve Chambers did not hire a ghost. Steve looked around his Gaston County neighborhood and found a guy named Michael McKinney. McKinney wasn't a cartel sicario. He wasn't a trained assassin. He was a local guy who liked to talk tough and wanted to be part of Steve's inner circle. Steve pulled him aside and offered him a deal that sounded like a fortune to a guy living paycheck to paycheck. Go to Mexico, find David Gant, and put a bullet in him. The price for this was $25,000. To Steve, 25 grand was pocket change he could literally dig out of the cushions of his new velvet sofa. To McKinney, it was a lottery ticket. He took the job. He packed a bag, grabbed a weapon, and boarded a flight to the Yucatan Peninsula. But Steve Chambers had engineered a murder plot with a glaring catastrophic flaw. He had sent an amateur who didn't speak a word of Spanish to a foreign country with no logistical support. Steve didn't give him a map, a safe house, or a getaway plan. He just gave McKinney David's phone number. Think about the absolute absurdity of that for a second. The hitman was told to call the target to ask for directions to the murder scene. When McKinney landed in Cozumel, he was completely out of his element. He was overwhelmed, lost, and sweating through his shirt. So he did exactly what Steve told him to do. He reached out to David. Now look at this from David Gant's perspective. He has been sitting in a sweltering hotel room for months. He is isolated, paranoid, and running out of money. The woman he loves isn't answering his calls. The mastermind who promised to take care of him is making excuses. Suddenly a guy from back home shows up. David doesn't see a threat. He sees a lifeline. He sees a familiar face from North Carolina, a proof that his friends hadn't forgotten about him. When they meet, David is practically overjoyed. And because McKinney is completely incapable of navigating the island by himself, he actually starts relying on David just to figure out where to eat. What happens next is one of the most bizarre psychological phenomena in the history of American crime. The hitman and the target become best friends. David takes McKinney out to dinner. He shows him the best bars. They go to the beach. They drink margaritas and talk about the people they know back home. McKinney is walking around with a gun tucked into his waistband, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. But the moment keeps getting pushed back. Why? Because they are having too much fun. It is the ultimate dark comedy. David Gant is using his dwindling supply of stolen cash to buy drinks for the man who is literally on the clock to end his life. But back in North Carolina, nobody is laughing. The FBI is sitting in a surveillance van a few hundred yards from Steve Chambers' mansion. They have wiretaps on his phone. And they are listening to the entire plot unfold in real time. They hear Steve calling McKinney in Mexico. The audio on those tapes is chilling. Steve is screaming at his hitman. He is demanding to know why the job isn't done. He tells McKinney to take David out into the woods and make sure he never comes back. McKinney stammers, makes excuses, and promises he will handle it tomorrow. Inside the FBI command center, the atmosphere completely shifted. Up until this point, Agent David Walden and his team had been playing a waiting game. In a massive financial crime, the goal is patience. You watch the suspects. You let them spend. You follow the money until you can locate the hidden millions. But the mission profile had just changed. This was no longer a theft investigation. It was a death watch. The FBI realized that if they waited one more day to find the missing money, they were going to be recovering a body instead of a fugitive. They had to act, and they had to act immediately. But they faced a massive logistical nightmare. If they raided the mansion in North Carolina and arrested Steve, the news would break instantly. McKinney would hear about it in Mexico, panic, and likely kill David to cover his tracks or flee into the jungle. Conversely, if they tipped off the Mexican police to arrest David and McKinney first, Steve Chambers would realize the gig was up and disappear with millions of dollars that the government still hadn't found. There was only one option. They had to execute a simultaneous international takedown. The FBI scrambled. They contacted federal prosecutors. They woke up judges to sign dozens of arrest warrants. They established an emergency line with Mexican law enforcement in Playa del Carmen, begging them to cooperate and move in on David and the hitman at an exact synchronized moment. The clock was ticking. On the wiretaps, Steve was losing his mind. He told McKinney that if David wasn't dead by the end of the week, Steve was going to cut McKinney off permanently. Down in Mexico, the bromance was finally souring. The pressure from Steve was making McKinney erratic. He was twitchy. He kept checking his weapon. And David, who had spent months looking over his shoulder, finally started to realize that something was deeply wrong. He noticed that every time he asked McKinney about Steve, or about his share of the $17 million, McKinney would change the subject or look away. The pieces were slowly falling into place in David's mind. The money had stopped coming. Kelly wasn't there. And this guy from North Carolina wanted to take a walk to a secluded part of the beach. The tension was suffocating. David was standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing he had built the entire trap himself. But before McKinney could find the nerve to pull the weapon, and before David could figure out a way to run, the calendar flipped to March 1, 1998. The FBI had their warrants. The tactical teams were in position. The trap was finally snapping shut. When the calendar flipped to Sunday, March 1, 1998, the waiting game officially ended. Executing a multi-agency, international takedown is like trying to conduct a symphony where half the musicians are actively trying to kill the other half. If the FBI moved on Steve Chambers in North Carolina first, word would reach Mexico, and Michael McKinney would likely panic and put a bullet in David Gant. If the Mexican police arrested David first, Steve would grab whatever cash he could carry and vanish. Everything had to happen at the exact same moment. Down in the sweltering heat of Playa del Carmen, David Gant was walking down the street. He was exhausted. He was broke. He had spent the last 5 months looking over his shoulder, wondering if the man walking next to him was a friend or an executioner. Suddenly, the street erupted. Unmarked cars screeched to a halt, blocking the road. Heavily armed Mexican federal police and American FBI agents poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting commands. In a Hollywood movie, this is the part where the fugitive pulls a gun, dives through a plate glass window, and initiates a high-speed chase. David Gant didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't even yell. According to the agents on the scene, David just looked at the handcuffs, and he looked relieved. The agonizing charade was finally over. He didn't have to pretend to be a millionaire anymore. He didn't have to wonder if he was going to be murdered in his sleep. As the agents pushed him down against the hood of a car and ratcheted the steel cuffs around his wrists, David looked back at them and asked one single desperate question. "Did you get the others? Did you get Steve?" He knew. The fog of Kelly Campbell's promises had burned away, and David knew exactly what he was, a pawn who had outlived his usefulness. At that exact second, 2,000 miles north, the quiet manicured streets of the Kramer Mountain gated community were shattered by the sound of sirens. Federal tactical teams breached the gates. They didn't knock politely. They swarmed the driveway of the $600,000 mansion. They found Steve and Michelle Chambers sitting in the middle of their stolen empire. Imagine the absolute psychological shock of that moment. Steve Chambers genuinely believed he had outsmarted the federal government. He thought his time as a low-level informant made him a criminal mastermind. He was living in a palace, driving a BMW, and looking at his velvet painting of Elvis Presley. And then, his front door caved in. Agents poured into the house, dragging Steve out in handcuffs. But the FBI wasn't just hitting Kramer Mountain. They had other targets. While David Gant was staring at the pavement in Mexico, and Steve Chambers was watching his luxury empire crumble in Charlotte, a third federal task force was quietly surrounding a modest house in Jacksonville, North Carolina, near the coast. Inside was Michael McKinney. The hitman hadn't stayed in Mexico. He had failed to pull the trigger. He had spent his expense money, ruined the plan by becoming best friends with his target, and slunk back to North Carolina hoping Steve wouldn't make good on his threats. McKinney thought he was hiding out from his boss. He didn't realize he was hiding right in the crosshairs of the federal government. When the FBI kicked in his door, McKinney was taken without a fight. He wasn't just being swept up for a bank robbery. He was being hit with federal conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Across the county, other strike teams were kicking down the doors of Kelly Campbell, the accomplices who helped move the money, and the family members who had helped hide it. Within hours, 24 people were swept up in the federal net. The masterminds were finally in custody. But catching the criminals was only half the battle. Now the FBI had to become archaeologists. They had to find the remaining $14 million. What followed was one of the most bizarre treasure hunts in American history. The FBI literally tore the Kramer Mountain mansion apart. They ripped up the floorboards. They smashed through the drywall. They found hundreds of thousands of dollars vacuum-sealed and stuffed inside the walls of the house like insulation. But Steve hadn't kept it all in the mansion. The FBI had to start digging. Literally. They went to the properties of Steve's family members and accomplices in rural North Carolina. Agents with shovels, backhoes, and ground-penetrating radar began tearing up backyards. They found cash buried in plastic barrels under the dirt. They found money stuffed inside toolboxes. They found garbage bags full of hundreds crammed into the trunks of abandoned cars. They found stacks of bills hidden inside the door panels of the luxury vehicles Steve had bought. It was a staggering display of amateur wealth management. They had too much money and absolutely no idea how to launder it, so they just treated the earth like a giant piggy bank. While the agents were digging up the dirt, the lead investigators were digging into the minds of the suspects back at the federal building. Steve Chambers went into the interrogation room with his chin held high. He demanded a lawyer. He thought he could beat the charge. He thought the FBI only had circumstantial evidence based on his spending habits. Then, the agents brought out the tape recorder. They didn't interrogate Steve. They just pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Steve's own voice. They played the wiretaps of him yelling at McKinney to eliminate the problem in Mexico. In another room, Michael McKinney, the hitman who couldn't hit his target, was fed the exact same reality check. McKinney tried to play dumb. He tried to claim he was just taking a vacation in Cozumel. The FBI agents just smiled and hit play on their own tape recorder. McKinney sat in silence as he heard his own voice on payphones in Mexico, asking Steve for more money to get the job done. And then, he heard Steve's voice calling him an idiot, threatening to cut him off, and treating him like garbage. When McKinney heard the mastermind talking about him on tape, any shred of loyalty he had to the Gaston County kingpin evaporated. McKinney realized he was the ultimate fall guy. He was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for a murder he didn't commit. Also, Steve could keep buying Rolexes. McKinney flipped. Almost everyone flipped. Once the tapes were played, the conspirators turned on each other with blinding speed. It was a race to see who could cooperate with the government the fastest to shave years off their inevitable prison sentences. And at the center of it all was David Gant. He was extradited back to American soil, walking off a federal transport plane in shackles. The man who had broken his back to move 1.5 tons of cash was now facing a mountain of federal charges. But as he sat down with the prosecutors, David made a decision that would change the course of the trial. He didn't try to minimize what he did. He didn't try to claim he was brainwashed. David Gant looked at the federal agents and said, "I'll tell you everything." They had the wiretaps. They had the receipts for the BMWs and the Velvet Elvis. They had the records of cash payments for cosmetic surgery. But the biggest weapon the government had wasn't a tape recording or a financial ledger. It was the man sitting in the witness stand. David Gant took the oath, sat down, and didn't hold a single thing back. If Steve Chambers had hoped for some kind of thief's honor, he was profoundly disappointed. David laid out every single detail for the jury. He talked about the sheer agonizing physical labor of moving 2,800 pounds of cash. He talked about the promise of a new life with Kelly Campbell. And he talked about the freezing realization in Mexico that the people he burned his life down for had simply left him to die. The defense attorneys tried to paint David as the true mastermind, the guy who manipulated everyone else from the shadows. But David just looked at the jury and told the truth. He wasn't a genius. He was just a guy making $8.15 an hour who got tired of feeling completely invisible. The most devastating moments of the trial came when the FBI played the wiretaps. The jury sat in absolute silence as they listened to Steve Chambers casually order the execution of the man who had made him rich. They heard the frantic, nonsensical calls between Steve and his incompetent hitman. It became painfully clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't an Ocean's 11 crew. This was a group of people who had won the lottery by accident, and then immediately tried to set the ticket on fire. Steve Chambers, the idea man who thought he could buy his way into a Kramer Mountain dynasty with stolen money, was sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison. His dream of high society ended with a government auction, where federal marshals sold off his velvet paintings, his cars, and his house to recoup the stolen funds. Michelle Chambers received a sentence of 7 years and 10 months for her role in laundering the money and helping to hide it. Kelly Campbell, the woman whose promises pushed David over the edge, received 5 years and 10 months. The romance that David had risked his marriage, his country, and his freedom for was officially dead, buried under the weight of federal testimony. Michael McKinney, the hitman who became David's drinking buddy, received over 11 years. The deadliest bromance in Mexico ended with both men in separate cells, thousands of miles apart. And then there was David. Because he fully cooperated, because he testified against the masterminds, and because he showed genuine remorse, David Gant was sentenced to 7 years and 4 months. As the guards led him away, you had to wonder if he was doing the math in his head. For a few months of sheer paranoia in Mexico and a few drinks on a beach, he had traded the better part of a decade of his life. But here is the part of the story that still keeps investigators and treasure hunters up at night. The FBI did a magnificent job. Out of the $17.3 million stolen from the vault, agents recovered roughly $15 million. They found it stuffed in walls, buried in backyards, and tied up in luxury assets. But over $2 million simply vanished. To this day, $2 million remains entirely unaccounted for. Some of it was obviously spent on the ridiculous lifestyle, the cars, the jewelry, the lavish dinners. Some of it was burned in Mexico on bribes and fees in the criminal underworld. But $2 million is a massive amount of cash to just spend in a matter of months. Rumors still swirl around Gaston County. People talk about buried plastic barrels out in the woods. They talk about offshore accounts that the FBI never found. Every now and then, someone with a metal detector goes wandering through the North Carolina brush, hoping to find the hidden treasures of Loomis Fargo. But the reality is likely much more mundane. Greed is incredibly expensive. When you're paying for a life you have absolutely no idea how to afford, using money you didn't earn, you bleed cash until there is nothing left. David Gant served his time. He was released from federal prison in 2006. He didn't come out as a millionaire. He came out as a man who needed to find a job. He eventually went back to work, living a quiet, regular life. He even served as a consultant on a Hollywood movie called Masterminds, sitting on set and watching a comedic version of his own worst mistakes play out on camera. He didn't get the girl. He didn't get the money. He got a cautionary tale that he'll be telling for the rest of his life. The Loomis Fargo heist stands today not as a testament to the brilliance of the criminal mind, but as a monument to the humanity of failure. It is a story about what happens when the crushing routine of a hard life meets a desperate, blinding desire for something more. When you see an armored truck pull up to a bank today, you probably look at it and see security. You see heavy armor and guards. But if you know this story, you might also see something else. You might see a guy named David, a mountain of heavy paper, and the hardest lesson a person can learn. The most difficult part of a heist isn't getting the money out of the vault. It's living with the person you become once the door is open. This is the Heist Vault. Subscribe for more true crime heists, robberies, and thefts.